We're here today to have a dialogue about movement strategy, talk about some matters of common interest that maybe will interest you.
Well, we've been trying to plan this for 6 months, haven't we? So we've finally done it.
So what are we going to be talking about? So we're going to start off, we'll see where the conversation goes, but we're going to start off talking about the strategy of the climate movement with respect to the question of should we be being more radical, should we be being more moderate? So I'll make a few remarks about that to kick us off. Extinction Rebellion was founded as a radical flank to the existing environmental movement to pull the whole debate more in the kind of direction it needed to be pulled in. And I think it's pretty safe to say that it's a point of agreement between myself and Roger, and hopefully you watching as well, that in that ambition at least, Extinction Rebellion, especially in the UK, has really succeeded pretty damn well. That in the period from the autumn of 2018 through to April, May 2019, Extinction Rebellion's strategy succeeded in ripping open the debate and kicking open the Overton window and moving the whole thing. Extinction Rebellion did not achieve the letter of its demands, but power conceded something to each of its demands on the back of that massive movement of consciousness and of the conversation. We had the symbolic declaration of climate and environment emergency in Parliament. We had the first net zero law, albeit 25 years too late. And we had the parliamentary declaration of a climate citizens assembly, all achieved within months of that April rebellion. Pretty damn impressive. I think we're pretty proud of our parts in that, and perhaps you had a part in that as well. So where do we go from here? There have been various efforts to create a more radical flank to Extinction Rebellion. Roger's been intimately involved with most of those. So there was Heathrow Pause, there was Burning Pink, recently of course Insulate Britain. There's a new one brewing, which I think we're going to be talking about, which is quite exciting. My question has been, for the last year or so, whether that's the right direction to move in, or whether what we oughtn't to be doing is trying to exploit the space that Extinction Rebellion successfully opened up. And that's why I've started talking about the need for what I'm calling a moderate flank in climate activism. The need to fill the space that's been opened up with a whole set of new organisations, initiatives, movements, which are going to try to make happen on the ground, to a large extent, the changes that have failed to be brought in by government. So a few examples of what the moderate flank is that is already, I think, coming into existence. You've got Lawyers for Net Zero, which is trying to gather together lawyers to push for climate action through their discipline, through their law firms. You've got Wildcard, which is seeking to get the royal lands rewilded. Mothership, which is seeking to get mothers involved in innovative ways in climate and eco-action. And you've got the climate and the climate emergency centres movement, which I think is a very exciting development, seeking to create one-stop shops for climate and eco-action around the country. And the intriguing thing is that all of those were founded by people who've been quite big in XR. So people who, in some sense or another, like me, think actually maybe the most important thing right now, or at least maybe one of the most important things right now, is to try to co-create this new mass distributed moderate flank to fill the space that XR successfully opens up. So I think that's sort of a natural place to start, thinking about Roger as someone who's been advocating further radical flanks, and myself as someone who's been moving, if you will, slightly in the opposite direction of thinking, how might we actually create successful moderate flanks? Because, and this is the kicker, my firm belief is that it looks like we are not, at least for the next few years, in a period where we are going to get the numbers that we need getting involved in radical flank type outfits. Whereas it seems to me we could quite easily get millions, including defectors from the establishment, signing up to moderate flank organisations. So Roger, what do you make of that?
Rubbish! Oh dear. Right, so Yeah, it's always good to have a bit of gallows humour, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, well, as I said to you before we had the discussion, because we talked about it a little
Yeah.
bit, didn't we? As I have a problem with the usefulness of constructing strategy around the notion of a middle ground, a moderate flank, and a radical flank. Now, I'm not saying that's not useful in some contexts, but one of the things I've been trying to communicate for the last 2 or 3 years is what we're facing with the climate crisis is fundamentally, metaphysically, if you like, completely different than everyday political conflict.
Yep.
And this isn't a rhetorical point. It's not like I'm trying to get at people on the go. I'm saying objectively, in the sense that if we're honest enough to follow the science, which is what we're all supposed to be doing, there's 2 fundamental points, which is we're facing a cliff edge. And it's very difficult to acknowledge that. I mean, people go, yes, you know, the Arctic's going to melt in the summer, the Amazon's going to collapse. But we don't, it's very difficult to take on the full existential meaning of that, because for the last 10,000 years, without beating around the bush, people have gone, there's a crisis, we're going to we've got to deal with the crisis, and then everything's going to go back to normal.
Yes.
And for the first time in 10,000 years, the whole damn thing is never going to go back to normal, objectively, i.e. the basis of human habitability. And we know that leads on to 2 other points, which is, number one, it's not going to come back to normal ever, effectively, i.e. for the next 100,000 years. Some people say a bit less, some people say 4 million. I mean, who gives a damn?
Yeah.
And secondly, we've got human extinction in the frame. Now, that's very difficult to emotionally comprehend. But I think if we're going to be smart and clever and honest with ourselves, we have to acknowledge that human extinction, it's not guaranteed, but it's certainly in the ballpark, fundamentally changes our strategy and our ethics around what needs to happen. So what does that mean? It means, for me, what that means is there's no flanks, right? What that means for me is it's an emergency. And again, that's not a rhetorical political point. It's an objective emergency. In other words, like what we have in the climate movement is this constant toing and froing between the political and the objective, as you might say. So how I define the political is, you've got your interests, I've got mine, and we have an argument about it, and we build alliances against each other, and someone wins, and you get your interests, or I get mine, right? And that's a legitimate, for the sake of argument, that's a legitimate form of social activity, because obviously people have different interests. But objectively, with the climate, and I said this 4 years ago in the initial paper that led to the setting up of XR, my fundamental sort of first line point is an existential crisis is not, in that definition, a political crisis, in so much as objectively it's in everyone's interest for it not to happen. That's different than, I've got my political beliefs. So I'm not trying to denigrate the political. I'm just saying it doesn't fit, if we're honest with ourselves. And the problem is people like to go back into the comfort zone of the political, because we know what that loots like. It's like Rupert Read Roger, and we have coalitions and, political, all the stuff that we sort of know. So my core point here, I suppose, is there's only one position, which makes me sound like ultra dogmatic. But in my defense, what I'm trying to say is there are times, I'm just about to do a Facebook post about this, there are circumstances where everyone agrees there's only one position. There's only one position on rape. It's not like we're negotiating about it. There's only one position on child abuse. This is it's not political. It's obscene. It's an outrage. It's a moral catastrophe.
Yeah.
There was only one position on Hitler, dare I say it. You know, no one's saying, well, you know, some people do, obviously, but everyone with human values is saying there was no debate. You know, this guy had to go. And a sort of little aside on this is one of the things I think is interesting, and you know, about World War II, is you had this alliance of people right across the board from different cultures. I mean, talk about more about this.
Yeah.
Who had so much antagonism towards each other, culturally, politically, historically, but they all came together because if they knew if they didn't defeat Hitler, then all their values would be done in.
Yeah.
You know, that was the end.
Yeah.
It was the end of civilization, and it was true. It wasn't a, you know, so you know, the classic thing is conservative Catholics working with Republican socialists in the French Resistance. So the point those two groups were making is there was only one response to Hitler, which was resistance. There wasn't a moderate flank. You see what I mean? And that's what I'm trying to say. When you've got an emergency, when you've got 3 years left, you know, according to Sir David King, when you're looking at 100,000 years of whatever hell,
Yes.
there's only one strategic position and there's only one moral position, which is resistance. And I'll concretize that, right? Because what's that? Well, what that means is unless there's a good excuse, as it were, and obviously there are, not everyone can go into classical, you know, people have got responsibilities, but the vast majority of people are capable of saying to the government, you've crossed a line, you are now in an act of war against the next generation, the next 10,000 generations. You're in an act of war against the poor of the global south. You're in an act of war against the natural world. COP has utterly failed.
Completely
and
agree.
you have crossed a line which is non-negotiable. This is my fundamental point. This is my fundamental criticism of the NGOs, is there has to be a line where you go into resistance, objectively. And if we haven't crossed it with COP26, God knows when we are going to cross it. So, you know, my proposition to everyone is yes, you have to make a demand, like everyone has done in these situations during history. You make a demand, like Gandhi used to do, and Martin Luther King, and then you say, we will now go and disrupt society, whether it's motorways, you know, oil depots, hunger strikes, whatever it is, you know, not paying your taxes. There's an array, as we know, of different things, but you're obligated to do that morally. And also, I'll shut up in a minute, also, strategically, my whole core argument during the early days of XR is by speaking this truth, you maximize the mobilization of people who will then move to what you call the radical flank, but I would call the objective moral position. So it's not like if you present a moderate flank proposition, then you're sort of letting people off the hook. You see what I mean?
I do see what you mean, but let me try to respond. So let's take your Second World War analogy. Obviously, in many ways, it's a great analogy. What we need is that same spirit of emergency mobilization. It's a great example of people actually going beyond politics, beyond party politics, beyond ideology in the way you alluded to. So the classic example I like to cite is in the Second World War, people of all different political hues agreed on the need for food rationing as part of the response. They didn't agree to it because it was a socialist idea or because it led to a more equal society, which it did. They agreed to it because it was necessary for common survival. But now here's the thing. Although objectively, I agree with your analysis, we are in that situation, and objectively resistance is completely justified. That's why we were completely together through the first couple of years of Extinction Rebellion. The tragedy is that on the one hand, we've succeeded in moving climate consciousness a great deal. But on the other hand, that is still quite a kind of thin achievement, which has not come to dominate everyday politics. And we have not moved into emergency mode. And most people would not really deeply yet fully accept the analogy. One reason why they wouldn't, by the way, and this is very important, is that of course there is an objective difference between the situations. The Second World War was a classic example where you could hope that what would happen would be that people would succeed in coming together, defeat the enemy, and then basically more or less go back to normal. And in that way it's very different. As you said, Roger, we are in a long, essentially a permanent emergency. But that's a weird kind of emergency. It's very hard for it to feel like an emergency because of the way it moves so inexorably slowly on timescales and at geographical scales, which are so hard for human beings to comprehend. Now, what's the point of all this? Well, the point of all this is that what you did in the last 10 minutes or so is you kind of made my position look like a bit of a sort of copping out or like not really stepping up to the plate and so on. But what I'm trying to say is, look, the objective reality is that most people are not up to the plate yet in their thinking for all the success that we have had. Until we get a lot more people moving a lot further in their thinking and in their actions, until we have a lot more people, for example, really comprehending how profoundly vulnerable they, let alone their children, now are, it's not going to make sense to a lot of those people to do the kinds of desperate things that we feel driven to do. In particular, for example, I think that it's fair to say that the evidence shows that most people in this country did not understand why Insulate Britain were doing what they were doing, why it was justified to block motorways, etc. So, my argument is, because of that crucial difference, there is a case in relation to this emergency, this permanent, new, tragic, endlessly changing condition that we're in. There's going to be no going back to normal. There is an argument for, and there is a position for, and there is a place for what I'm calling the moderate flank approach in the way that there wasn't before. One other thing which is really, really important to understand about this is that these terms moderate and radical, you know, I accept that they're kind of quite crude and they're just placeholders, really. There's a sense in which the moderate flank is, or at least can be, more realistic and in a certain sense even more radical than the radical flank. What do I mean? Well, all the things that I've just said are part of the backdrop for the moderate flank approach, and what that involves is accepting that we are not going to get the kind of overnight transformation that we really need to be getting and ought to be getting. I mean, let's think again about XR's demands, for example. Second demand, go carbon neutral and stop ecosystem destruction by 2025. Well, you know, it's now 2022, right? And it's clear every passing day that that demand is simply, you know, no longer credible in a time kind of analysis. Now, your approach, Roger, I totally accept the sort of objective analysis and the place of desperation and fury that it's coming from, which I think is reasonable. But there is a danger that your approach allows people to carry on thinking, you know what, if we up the ante enough, if we block enough motorways, etc., then we'll win, the government will fall, we'll take over, there'll be a revolutionary transformation, we'll achieve our demands really quickly, and then we can go back to normal. I mean, I think that is what some people kind of think. They kind of think that if the radical flank really succeeded, then we would be able to absolutely fix this. Whereas the moderate flank approach is a bit more kind of saying, you know what, people are not quite there yet. The nature of this emergency is different. Government is simply not stepping up to the plate. We're going to have to do what we can through our workplaces, through our local communities, etc., to start to make changes directly on the ground that are objectively needed and that government is failing to do, which is another way that you might argue that the moderate flank is as radical as or more radical than the radical flank, actually directly doing the changes that need to be happen rather than asking someone else to do them. But also what I was getting at was, the crucial thing about this is that this part of the moderate flank analysis kind of accepts that it's 5 past midnight, that we're not going to get everything sorted, that we're going to fail to reach the demands that XR's put down, that 1.5 degrees is gone, that the situation is going to be one of managing a disastrous, potentially catastrophic situation endlessly, that there isn't going to be any kind of fixing of it. And there's a kind of, I think there's a kind of maturity to that and a kind of invitation to psychological reflection. Whereas there is, as I say, this slight danger that if you just remain endlessly in the radical flank kind of mindset, then you never get to have that kind of pause. And you never get to look inward in this way, this really kind of painful way of kind of accepting, my God, you know, our demands are objectively justified, the situation is as it is, resistance is completely justified, and yet it's not happening. We don't have the numbers. We're not going to succeed in making these changes and completely winning.
Yeah, okay, so I think, with all due respect, you might be mixing up the sociological with the normative. What I mean by that, I'm sure you know what I mean, but to expand it, it's like, I will happily concede to you that in any process of political, social transformation, there's always some people that really want something, some people that want it a bit, and a long tail, as it were, of people who are maybe, right? That's a iron law of human activity, right? You know, it's a normal distribution curve for the sake of argument. So there's a certain sociological determinism about that. Like, any time there's change, by definition, there's some people that are really full on about it, and a long tail of people that are, you know, maybe type people. But that analysis has no necessary impact upon a normative and a strategic analysis, right? So the normative analysis is asking the question, this is the situation, that's the sociological one. The normative question is, what should I do? What should you, as Rupert, do over the next year with your time? What do people watching this need to do? That's a really concrete moral point. And then there's the strategic thing is, you know, what's actually going to have most effect, right? So I think there's a little bit of what you're saying is it's just sort of, there's a slight sort of, because that's the way of the world, we have to fit into the way of the world, if you see what I mean. So one point I want to sort of...
I mean, it's more partly that I'm trying to kind of accept the reality where we're at, for example, in terms of the numbers, right? So if we look at the Chenoweth kind of numbers, 3.5%. So XR is saying we're going to get millions on the street in April 2022. You know, I hope XR succeed in that objective. I'll be completely astounded if they do. Whereas I think it is possible that we could get millions involved in what I'm calling the moderate flank. And part of the reason it's possible is because of the success that XR had in 2019. So that's why I started out by saying, what do we learn from what happened in 2019? Do we learn the lesson, let's do more of the same? Do we learn the lesson, let's up the ante and go more radical? Or do we learn the lesson, now a lot of people have had their minds open and are ready for something. What is that something? Maybe it's the kind of stuff that I and, you know, Lawyers for Net Zero and the Climate Emergency Centres and so on are talking about.
Yeah. So I'm going to come on to that. But I just want to finish this point about starting with the way the world is and saying, because the world is like X, we have to fit in with X. So, you know, I'm just reading a book at the moment about, you know, doomster type people in the States, and they're basically saying, we looked at the science, the human race is going to get destroyed. There's no question about it. There's no point in doing anything. And therefore, normatively, we shouldn't do anything. Well, that therefore is not rational. It's like just because the world is like that doesn't mean we have to accept it. And this you know, the reason I'm emphasising this is the heart of the activist proposition, which is we have agency to create change. We're not subject to these laws. And the other point, of course, the sociological point is, the more that you accept the world as it is, the more the world will be as it is. In other words, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's one of the most vile things about cowardly fatalism, is it's not just, oh, well, you know, fair enough, you don't want to do anything. What you're basically saying is to other people, don't do anything as well. And so you're actually creating it right? In so much as it's not objectively done, right? You know, I mean, it's a hypothesis. We don't know whether we're going extinct, but it's definitely on the cards. That